The funeral home smelled like carnations and carpet cleaner, and I have hated both smells since. 90 minutes earlier, I'd zipped my father into a suit he hadn't worn since my wedding, the one I never finished paying for. Now I stood on the church steps in Erie watching my sister smoke a cigarette she swore she'd quit 4 years ago. "Don't," I said. "Don't what?" Vesper didn't look at me. "Grieve wrong." I didn't answer. Grief in our family had rules nobody wrote down and everybody followed. Rule 1. Nothing happens today. Rule 2. Whatever happens today gets discussed tomorrow in private without Mom. Vesper dropped the cigarette, ground it under her heel and looked at me for the first time since the burial. "Get in the car," she said. "There's something you need to see before the lawyer reads anything." I got in the car. The funeral home smelled like carnations and carpet cleaner, and I have hated both smells since. 90 minutes earlier, I'd zipped my father into a suit he hadn't worn since my wedding, the one I never finished paying for. Now I stood on the church steps in Erie watching my sister smoke a cigarette she swore she'd quit 4 years ago. "Don't," I said. "Don't what?" Vesper didn't look at me. "Grieve wrong." I didn't answer. Grief in our family had rules nobody wrote down and everybody followed. Rule 1. Nothing happens today. Rule 2. Whatever happens today gets discussed tomorrow in private without Mom. Vesper dropped the cigarette, ground it under her heel and looked at me for the first time since the burial. "Get in the car," she said. "There's something you need to see before the lawyer reads anything." I got in the car. "I'm Odessa Fenn. I'm 30. I restore furniture for a living. The kind of restoration where you spend 6 weeks recaning a single chair seat and charge $140 for it. Because nobody in Erie, Pennsylvania is paying antique shop prices for a stranger's grandmother's rocker. My father, Walton Fenn, taught me everything I know about wood grain and dovetail joints and the particular silence of a workshop at 6 a.m. He also apparently taught my sister something he never taught me: how to keep a secret. Vesper drove without talking. Highway 5 south, then west on 20, the lake going gray and flat beside us, until Erie became farmland, became Ashtabula, Ohio, 40 minutes over the state line. I hadn't been to Ashtabula since I was maybe 9. My father used to disappear there on what he called buying trips. Estate sales, auction houses, barns full of furniture nobody wanted anymore. He'd come home smelling like linseed oil and diesel and Mom would ask how it went and he'd say fine, and that would be the whole conversation. "Why are we here?" I said when Vesper finally pulled off County Road 9 onto a gravel lot fronting a long brick building. Loading dock. Rusted steel roll door. A faded sign that just said Fenn, no other words, like the building already assumed you knew what came after. "Dad's storage unit," Vesper said. "Except it's not a storage unit. It's 4,000 square feet and he's been paying the lease on it since before you were born." I stared at the building. "Mom's never mentioned this. Mom doesn't know." That sentence sat in the car with us like a third passenger. My mother, Carol Fenn, had been married to my father for 38 years. She organized his sock drawer. She knew his cholesterol numbers better than her own. And apparently there was a building 40 minutes from their house that she'd never once heard of. "How do you know about it?" I asked. Vesper's jaw tightened. "Because he told me. 6 years ago. And he made me promise." I felt something crack open in my chest, small and cold. The particular grief of learning your father trusted someone else with something he never trusted you with. I didn't say that out loud. I've spent my whole life not saying things out loud in front of Vesper. He got out of the car. I followed her across the gravel, my funeral heels sinking with every step, and she fitted an old brass key into a side door I hadn't even noticed, human-sized, tucked beside the roll door like an afterthought. "Before we go in," Vesper said, hands still on the key, "I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Keep this between us. Don't tell Mom." "Not yet. Not until I figure out what we're supposed to do with it." I should have asked why. That's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I turn over at 2 a.m. like a bad tooth. I should have asked why my sister needed 6 years to decide whether our mother deserved to know her husband had a second building full of secrets. Instead I said okay because Vesper asking me to keep a secret was, in its own broken way, the first time in a decade she'd asked me for anything. She opened the door. She flipped a switch and the warehouse blinked awake in long fluorescent rows, and I froze in the doorway with my hand still on the frame. The place was full. Not full of junk, full of furniture. Rows and rows of it, tagged and shelved and wrapped in moving blankets, more pieces than I could count in one glance. Federal-style secretaries. A pair of matched Chippendale wingbacks. A walnut highboy I recognized on sight as at least Civil War era. Crates stacked along the back wall, labeled in my father's blocky handwriting. Hardware, veneer, finish samples. He's been buying pieces for 30 years, Vesper said quietly, like the building demanded a lower voice. Underpriced estate sales, farm auctions, church liquidations. Buying them, restoring the ones worth restoring, holding the rest. Holding them for what? I don't know. That's the part one couldn't figure out alone. I walked into the aisle nearest the door, ran my hand along a mahogany sideboard with hand-cut dovetails, the kind of joinery you don't see anymore because nobody has the patience to teach it. My own shop, the one I inherited half interest in from my father 3 years ago, was 6 weeks behind on invoices and 2 months behind on the lease. I had turned away a $22,500 estate commission in March because I didn't have the capital to front the materials. And 40 minutes from my front door, my father had been sitting on a building full of exactly the kind of inventory that could have saved it. I didn't ask Vesper if she knew that. I already knew she didn't. Vesper sold insurance in Cleveland. She'd never once asked how the shop was doing, and I'd never once told her because that was our rule too. Nothing happens today and today never ends. We walked the aisles for 20 minutes without talking much. I found a tag on the highboy in my father's handwriting. V. For the wedding if it ever happens. Vesper's engagement had ended 4 years ago. She stood in front of that tag a long time, and I watched something move behind her eyes that I didn't have a name for. There's an office, she said finally, voice rough. Records. I haven't gone through all of it. The office was a converted corner, glass-walled. A metal desk that had probably been in there since the Ford administration. Filing cabinets. A corkboard covered in receipts, auction paddles, a photograph of my father at maybe 40, younger than I'd ever really pictured him, standing in front of the warehouse with his arm around a man I didn't recognize. That's Reuben, Vesper said, following my eyes. Reuben Castillo. He used to run inventory here. Dad paid him off the books for years. I found the ledger. Is he still around? I called him last week. He still lives in Conneaut. He agreed to meet us if we wanted. I sat down at the desk, my funeral dress bunching around my knees, and pulled open the top drawer. Appraisals. Dozens of them spanning back 15 years from an appraiser named Delphine Ackerman out of Cleveland. The most recent one was dated 8 months before my father's stroke. I read the total at the bottom twice before it made sense. $341,000. Not counting 3 unappraised crates in the back, marked only hardware, walnut lot. Vesper. My voice didn't sound like mine. Does the will say anything about this place? The will splits the house and the shop 50-50 between us. It doesn't mention this building at all. She sat on the edge of the desk. Which means it's not in the estate. Which means either Dad forgot to put it in or he didn't want it in the estate. I understood before she finished. Because if it's in the estate it gets split with Mom's knowledge and probated and taxed as one lump. But if it's structured as something else, Vesper said, it might already belong to just us. Or just one of us. I don't know which. That's why I needed you here before I opened anything else. I sat with that for a long moment, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, my father's handwriting on every crate around me like he was still in the room, quietly not explaining himself the way he never had. Here's the thing I never told anyone, not even Vesper, not until that afternoon in the office. My father and I hadn't spoken in the 6 weeks before his stroke. Not a fight exactly, a silence, the kind that starts as one skipped phone call and calcifies into a habit. He'd wanted to co-sign a business loan to expand my shop and I'd said no because I didn't want to owe him anything else, not after 28 years of feeling like everything I had, the workshop skills, the half interest in the business, even my own hands, had come through him first and me second. I wanted one thing that was mine. So I said no to the loan and he said fine, and we didn't talk, and then he had a stroke in his own driveway on a Tuesday in September and never woke up enough to finish the argument. I sat in that office and understood all at once that I would never get to ask him why he built a second life 40 minutes from the first one. I would never get to ask if this was supposed to be an apology or an inheritance or a test or nothing at all. Just a man who liked buying beautiful things nobody else wanted and hiding them the way he hid everything that mattered. The grief came up so fast I had to put both hands flat on the desk to keep from folding in half. I didn't cry loudly. I never do. I sat very still and let it move through me the way you let a wave move through you if you don't fight it. And Vesper, who I hadn't seen show me tenderness since we were teenagers, put one hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything at all, and for about 90 seconds, we were just two women who'd lost the same person in different ways, standing in a room full of his secrets. Before you keep watching, tell me, have you ever found out someone you loved had a whole part of their life you knew nothing about? I'm reading every comment on this one. We called Reuben that night from a diner off Route 20, the kind with vinyl booths and a pie case that hadn't been restocked since lunch. He was 71, soft-spoken, and he cried a little when we told him Dad had passed, which none of my father's actual friends back in Erie had done at the funeral that morning. He built that inventory for you too, Reuben said, stirring coffee he wasn't drinking. Not for resale. He used to say, Odessa's shop is gonna need capital someday, and I'm not gonna be around to write the check, so I'm gonna leave her the check in wood. I felt my throat close. Then why didn't he tell me? Reuben was quiet a second. Man had pride like a load-bearing wall and about as flexible. He didn't want you taking a loan from him. Sounds like maybe you didn't want to take one either. He looked at me carefully. You two argue about that before? I nodded. I didn't trust my voice enough to say more. He wasn't punishing you, Reuben said. He built you an out that didn't feel like charity. Whether he'd have ever handed you the key, I don't know. Maybe he was still deciding. Man ran out of time before he ran out of stubbornness. Vesper had gone quiet across the booth, turning her coffee cup in slow circles. There's something else, she said finally. Reuben. Why'd Dad tell me about this place and not her? Reuben looked between us. He told you because you asked him for money 6 years ago and he didn't have liquid cash. He had this. He showed you the building so you'd understand why the answer was no, not because he trusted you more. He made you promise not to tell your sister because he was ashamed she'd think less of him for hoarding it instead of using it. Not because he loved you different. He shook his head. That man kept every secret in this world for the exact wrong reasons. I watched Vesper's face do something complicated, relief and shame arriving at the same time the way they often do. I understood then that the 6 years of silence I'd resented her for hadn't been Vesper choosing him over me. It had been Vesper carrying a secret that was never supposed to be a wedge, just one more thing our father couldn't say out loud. The subplot of my own shop had been sitting under all of this the entire time, and it hadn't gone anywhere. I still owed $2,800 a month on a lease I could barely make, still had a supplier threatening to cut my materials credit, still had that $22,500 estate commission I'd had to walk away from in March because I didn't have the capital to front it. I'd spent 3 years telling myself the shop's failure was a referendum on whether I could do this without my father's name attached to it. Sitting in that diner booth, I understood for the first time that refusing his help hadn't proven my independence. It had just meant the shop suffered for my pride the same way our relationship had suffered for his. We drove back to the warehouse 2 days later with Delphine Ackerman, the appraiser, who confirmed what her 8-month-old paperwork already said and added $40,000 more once she opened the walnut lot crates. Hand-forged brass hardware, the kind collectors pay absurd money for, still packed in the same newspaper my father had wrapped it in a decade ago. October 14th, one crate read in pencil under the newsprint. A date that meant nothing to me until Vesper pointed out it was the day I'd opened my shop. He kept dating things to us, she said. Even when he never told us. We told Mom that Sunday. Not because Vesper's promise had expired, but because sitting on it any longer felt like becoming him. Keeping the good and the complicated locked in a building nobody else could reach. Mom cried for a long time at the kitchen table, not with anger, just the particular grief of learning a person you'd loved for 38 years still had rooms in him you'd never been shown. He always did love things nobody else wanted, she said finally, wiping her eyes. I guess I should have known he'd love a building full of them too. I didn't say the thing I was thinking, which was that he'd loved his daughters the same complicated way, quietly, sideways, in objects instead of sentences. I don't think he ever learned another language for it. Reuben stayed on with us, part-time, cataloging what's left. Vesper and I split the building the way the will never had to tell us to, not by law but because for the first time since we were kids, we sat in a room together and actually decided something instead of just enduring it. My shop is solvent now. Not rich. Solvent. I paid off the lease with the first quarter's proceeds and I still have that walnut highboy sitting in my workshop, unsold because some things you inherit and some things you just keep. I didn't get closure. I want to be honest about that because everyone wants the neat ending where the dead parent's secret resolves into a clean gift and a clean goodbye, and that isn't what this was. I still don't know if my father ever meant to tell me himself, or if he was going to let that building sit sealed for another 20 years out of pure load-bearing pride. I'll never get to ask him. Some days that absence feels like a door still cracked open. Most days it just feels like a door. Have you ever found out something about someone you loved only after it was too late to ask them why? Tell me below. I read every one of these and lately I think I need to,